Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We're all about hashtag Go for Two in 22. We believe that Georgia could be in its pursuit of a second national championship for Coach Kirby Smart and these Georgia players. In fact, a second consecutive national championship. We believe that is very much a realistic possibility for Georgia here this season, and we're going to be talking a lot about how that occurs here and doing some of that with y'all here today in just a couple of minutes. Also, we're really excited because former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm going to join us again today, as he will now every Tuesday throughout the rest of this season. Obviously, with a Georgia team playing as well as it is right now, our coverage needs to be at its top-notch best, and Jake Fromm is obviously a big part of that. We'll do that with Jake here coming up in a little bit, and in addition to that, Connor Riley going to stop by and be a part of the program here today there as well. So some really fun stuff coming up on our program. Hemingway in our comment section, we do a First and 15 at DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app, prior to getting going with the regular show. And he was talking about how right now it sort of feels like all systems are go and everything is good for UGA fans. Number one, with really very little to worry about right now, and you sort of get the sense that's true. One of the things we're also going to talk about when the kind of show kicks off in a second, the level of praise that Georgia's getting, and admittedly I've probably contributed to some of this, but even kind of outside the bubble of DawgNation, the level of praise that Georgia's starting to get is pretty exaggerated and it's pretty funny. We'll talk about that. We'll give you the sort of, as you would expect, customary response from Kirby Smart, some of that kind of stuff. However, I think this is important. And some of this is kind of foreshadowed a little bit by what John Stinchcomb and I talked about yesterday, but I do believe that there is one thing about this year's pursuit of a national championship, no matter how it ends, whether Georgia actually claims it again or not, there is one thing about this year's pursuit that I believe is different from last year, and I think that's important. I think it's different for a good reason. We'll talk about that here coming up in just a couple of moments. Also, something else that's been in our comment section so far today, the thoughts of William Poole, who steps away from the Georgia team. Poole putting that on social media, Kirby Smart confirming that during his press conference yesterday. So a lot of us have very, very fond memories of William because of what he did for Georgia at the end of last season, becoming a key contributor late in the year, including in the national championship game. So obviously lots of thought with William Poole as he steps away from football right now. We clearly root for him with whatever he would do next. And so we wish him well as he's no longer with this Georgia football team, but you certainly wish him well in regards to all of that. Also, thanks to all of you for being here today. We're going to have a really, really fun time breaking down everything when it comes to Georgia football. Connor Riley, as I said, Jake Fromm, as I said. What does Fromm think in particular about the start that Stetson Bennett's gotten off to this season? And is it a realistic possibility that Stetson Bennett could actually win the Heisman Trophy? We'll talk to Jake Fromm about that and a whole lot more. But off the top of the program today, Georgia kind of back in the same position now that it was a year ago. But there is one thing I believe about this year's national championship pursuit, the feeling maybe that it's conjuring up among these Georgia coaches and players that probably should be and unlikely is different than it was last year. I'm going to tell you what that is and why it matters, and some kind of cool stuff about Georgia in light of all of this as we get things going. So happy to have you with us. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So after 3 games of the 2022 season, a lot of you are aware of this, the level of hype that's starting to grow around Georgia is becoming fairly ludicrous, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I just sort of mean in how exaggerated it's become. It's just like, oh my gosh, this is getting to be kind of a lot. I saw where the Kent State coach yesterday said that this Georgia team is the greatest collection of talent ever assembled, which is kind of a funny thing to say, and the kind of thing that Kirby Smart probably doesn't love hearing necessarily, but kind of funny to hear an opposing coach say something so matter-of-fact of it's never been a greater collection of talent on one team at one time than what this Georgia team has right now. That's kind of funny. You've seen other media people kind of doing some of the same kind of stuff. Peter Burns, obviously you know him from the SEC Network, friend of the show. He's been a guest of ours a couple times in the past. Peter Burns on his radio show on like Sirius XM in the morning He also kind of had a very bold take recently about the status of the Georgia Bulldogs. In fact, as a way of kind of setting us up for what I want to talk about here today, let me let you hear Peter Burns with a very exaggerated claim about what he thinks the rest of the season looks like for the Georgia Bulldogs. This is Peter on that.
The Georgia Bulldogs are going to go down as one of the greatest college football teams we've ever seen, and they will go undefeated this entire season, and they will not even have an opponent get within single digits of them right now. Great on offense, great on defense, great on special teams.
Now, I like Peter Burns a lot, and I think that Peter's not a Johnny-come-lately when it comes to UGA. As many of you know, he picked Georgia to win the national championship last year, so I got no beef with Peter Burns. But all of this is kind of a snapshot of the silliness of the media sometimes, because like the one thing, it's kind of nice when you find yourself in a position not to have to like wildly change your position based on new information. We're the kind of people around here that we sort of make up our mind quickly and then change our mind slowly. Hopefully we're reasoned and measured enough that we don't have to like dramatically alter our point of view. And we told you a lot over the course of this offseason that, of course, Georgia's going to be back in the conversation again. And, of course, you know, Georgia is going to have a chance to do everything in 2022 just like it did in 2021. Of course, that's a possibility. The one narrative that we pushed back against a lot back then was this idea that unanimously everybody's sure that the reigning national champs, Georgia, are clearly supposed to be slotted behind Ohio State, which to begin the year they were, and Alabama, which to begin the year they were. The idea that everyone is so sure this is just destined to be the case, to me, that always seemed really weird that everyone was in agreement about that. Not that there wasn't a case for Ohio State, and by the way, there still is. And not that there wasn't a case for Alabama, and once again, by the way, there still is. Of course, there are cases to be made for other teams, but the idea that everyone seemed to agree on that case at the expense of UGA, we always thought that was just really, really weird. And all of a sudden now, after 3 weeks, everybody's completely wadded up that opinion and thrown it in the trash, and all of a sudden now you got people saying that that Georgia's the greatest collection of talent of all time. They're not even going to play a game within single digits all year. They're going to go undefeated along the way to win a national championship without ever being challenged whatsoever. Like, a lot of that changes just really, really fast, and it's kind of remarkable to think about how quickly the media has done an about-face after doubting Georgia throughout the offseason, but pretty quickly crowning them after 3 weeks of during the season. A lot of that is just happening at a very fast pace. Now, admittedly, I've probably also contributed to some of this myself. I told you on Saturday that I thought it was time to have the conversation not about how much Georgia is going to have regressed from last year's national championship team, but maybe how much Georgia's progressed from that. And the notion that maybe this Georgia team is actually better than last year's national championship team was. It seemed appropriate to me after Saturday to sort of have that discussion. So I can't get on others for hyping up Georgia too much when I myself am kind of sort of guilty of all of that. Now, as you might imagine, Georgia coach Kirby Smart's response to all of this is sort of exactly the way that you think it might be. He's not into my comparison between 22 and 21. He's not into Peter Burns hype or opposing coach hype or anything anybody else in the media is saying right now. That Kirby Smart is as sort of locked in and laser focused as he always was, and he's pushing his players to be the exact same they've always been. This is a very predictable response from Kirby, but appropriate to hear nonetheless. Kirby from yesterday on those like me saying that this team is actually better than last year's national championship team. This is what Kirby Smart said about that.
Kirby, I know it's only 3 games in, but obviously a lot of people seeing the scores y'all put up and the numbers you put up, already, comparisons to last year. After losing so many guys, is it far-fetched to say this team by the end of the year could be as good or better than last year's squad?
I don't do comparisons. I've said that repeatedly. You can't compare anybody to last year because last year's teams, 15 of them are in the NFL. So it's one of those things that this team has a long way to go. The worst thing that can happen to this team is start believing what people say about them. The toughest job we got this week is trying to explain to everybody that Kent State's a really good football team. And I know you think I just sit up here and say that, but you turn the tape on, they've got a really, really good football team. And it's not so much about Kent State. It's really about, does our team want to grow? And this is a week that we need to have growth. We got to get better in a lot of spots. And you guys don't get to see it from our perspective, and the fans don't get to see it from our perspective in terms of what we see on tape and the mistakes we make and how many guys we need to get better. But certainly going to need them to get better this week.
So as I said before, all of this to a degree, is just very predictable. Media folks like me are going to hype up Georgia. Coaches like Kirby Smart are going to push back against that hype, and he's going to challenge his players to stay focused and stay grinding and tune all of that out. All of this is just very predictable. And there's a lot of fans that probably are like, good, Kirby. Hey, make sure this team stays, grinding to the bone. Make sure this team stays as laser focused and as intense as ever. Don't let them kind of buying into any of this hype. All of that just sort of seems really, really predictable. But I do truly believe, though, we see some evidence around Georgia right now that the actual story for UGA may not quite be as predictable as that, and that the actual story for UGA might actually be a little bit more interesting and a little bit better than that. Let me see if I can explain this the right way. I think that if you were to talk to some Georgia coaches last year, especially Kirby Smart, and maybe even some Georgia players, and I think if you could get them in their most honest moment imaginable, in the most honest moment possible, and ask them, hey, what was the feeling after the national championship was over? What was the feeling after that season was done? I think if you got Kirby Smart in a truly honest moment, here's what he might say. There was a little bit of a feeling of relief that, oh, thank goodness we went out there and did what I always believed, Kirby would say about himself, was possible, that we went out there and actually won the national championship, that we got over that hump of Alabama, that we actually got this done. And that may be a feeling that's more true for the coaches, but I believe there's also a version of that might be true for the players there as well. For guys like Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt and others who were kind of senior players in this program who had been here for a while and knew they were a part of a program that was so close to a national championship, they also knew there was a possibility where their career at Georgia could end without getting that done. And you got to think for some of those guys, maybe they felt like there's a little bit of a hole in the resume had they been close to a national championship for virtually the entirety of their career, but come up short in that and come up short to a team like Alabama again, that they just would have felt really this sort of nagging sense of incompletion if that had been the case. And yet when you beat Alabama, when you win the national championship, finally they're the ones to kind of bring that back to Georgia. The critics, the 40-plus years, all that kind of stuff, it just all goes away. There might have been a sense of relief for some of the players too. Definitely for the coaches, especially for Kirby, but maybe for some of the players. But here's the thing. That notion of you're coaching and you're playing with so much pressure and you're so wound tight and you're gripping so hard and you're straining so hard. That's a word we've heard Kirby use a lot. The notion of going that hard towards a goal like that and being relieved when you finally achieve it, as opposed to elated, but just relieved. Thank goodness we did this. But more than like the sort of the euphoric feeling of how happy you are. Y'all, that's the kind of thing you can only do one time. You can only do that once. You can't come back with the same race car in the red level of pressure on yourself back in 2022 the way you did in 2021. It's just not possible to do it that way. Human beings aren't designed to stay that intense for such a long time. That if relief is what defined the Georgia team in 2021 when that goal was finally achieved and the season was finally over, I think that you have to have a different word to define how this team is pursuing itself in 2022, because all of a sudden now, you're not the team trying to win its first national championship in a long time. You're the team trying to come back and do all of this all over again. And if Georgia can do that in 2022, there's a sense in which this is just sort of a permanent state for the program, at least for right now, sort of a common state for the program, at least for right now, where you could be in this same situation year after year after year. So I don't know that you could approach every single year as relief when it's over. I think it has to be more about relaxed while it's going on. I think you have to be comfortable in the spotlight. You have to be comfortable in pursuit of this goal, and you have to kind of enjoy yourself along the way, because you may win the national championship, but coaches won't want to work here. Players won't want to play here. It'll all feel very transactional and very short term. And I think there's some evidence right now that Georgia kind of understands this. I think if last year the season was about, hey, staying focused, blocking out the noise, working, getting to the goal, and then being relieved when it was finally over, I think there's some evidence right now that Georgia's approaching this season with a far different mindset. And while they are just as focused and intense as ever, it's not about pushing yourself towards a goal and then being relieved when it's over. I think there is a sense in which some of this is about stopping and enjoying the process along the way, enjoying the time they're spending with each other, player with player, enjoying the time they're spending with each other, coach with coach, coach with player, the entire organization, the connectedness or connection that Kirby Smart, talks about a lot. I think there's some examples of that being true right now. So there's something to keep in mind, that as Georgia goes about its business here in 2022, it may not be wound quite as tight as it was in 2021, when it was all said and done, there was this sense of relief when it was over. Now they actually may be stopping to enjoy themselves a little bit along the way. I think there are two specific examples of how this is true. And after I introduce the show, I'm going to tell you more about it. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us. Live on video, we start 9:45 on our 1st and 15 at DawgNation.com and on the DawgNation app. 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're on the radio at noon, app and Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and it's just great to have you no matter which platform you join us on, and it's great to be able to talk to you about the challenge, the mission of hashtag Go for 2 in 22. That's the message we're pushing around here, and we believe that's a real possibility for UGA, and we like the mindset that Georgia seems to have as it pursues that goal here a little bit this season. More on that coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, big thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for being a big part of what we do here today. When it comes to foundation waterproofing issues, they are the name to know. They're longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily. Got a message from somebody on Twitter just this past week who has a retirement center and had some issues that need to be dealt with. Reached out to Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Could not say nicer things about the folks at ESOG, the work that they did for him. And I got to tell you, that means so much to me. A, that you all are supporting those who support us, but also that the things that I tell you on here turn out to be true. I know they're true, but I'm glad to find out you're finding that out yourself, that folks like Engineered Solutions of Georgia just do great work for you. Now, the reason why they do is because they have an entire team of engineers on staff to satisfy your need, whether it be a waterproofing type situation or a foundation type situation, see the cracks in your walls or the water creeping in where it's not supposed to be. They're really the only organization in the market right now that can say they've got that level of resources being put to work for you. Now, being a solutions-based company, sometimes they're able to give you some good news, that the problem you think you have isn't quite as big as you think it might be. Obviously, when you see evidence of water creeping in or cracks in the wall, something along those lines, your immediate response might be fear, concern, anxiety. In many cases, ESOG can say, actually, it's not as bad as you might think. You can just go to the hardware store and get a blah, 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 whatever else, and that's going to solve your problem. But there are times when the work is more substantial than that, and all the more reason to have experts like our friends at Engineered Solutions on the job. They're also proud partners of UGA, and we obviously like it when you support those that support UGA, and that's what our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia are all about there as well. So if you've got a foundation issue, if you've got a waterproofing issue, reach out to my friends there. You can find them online, or you can actually give them a call. Very, very easy number to dial. Just simply dial 678-ESOG now. That is 678-ESOG now, and that'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, we have a very busy show here today. Before we're done, we're going to catch up with Connor Riley. And Georgia's 3-0, blowing out South Carolina, looking pretty good, obviously looking maybe better through 3 games than it ever has before. But where do they go from here, both in terms of the game against Kent State on Saturday, a team that, maybe a little bit more interesting than sometimes they're given credit for being. Already played a very tough schedule. Certainly that's the case. But also beyond that into the rest of the conference slate to come after that. We'll get some thoughts from Connor Riley on that here coming up in just a little bit. Also, if you're with us on yesterday's show, I made a very big announcement that every Tuesday here on this program for the rest of the season, we're going to be lucky to be joined by former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm, including here coming up in just a couple of minutes there as well. Jake, obviously a part of that foundational early days of the Kirby Smart era on a college football playoff team in 2017, a guy that still spends a lot of time around the program, but certainly knows what it's like to be behind closed doors in the inner workings with a coach like Kirby Smart. Also great insight from him on Stetson Bennett. In fact, in a moment, knowing that Jake played the position that Stetson's playing right now, we'll get into more detail about the kind of year that he thinks that Stetson Bennett is having, and whether or not he thinks it's a realistic possibility that Stetson Bennett could be a part of the Heisman Trophy conversation here this year. Certainly there seems to be some growing momentum for that. How real is all of this? We'll talk to Jake Fromm about that here coming up in just a couple of moments. Before that, though, I want to go around the doghouse. It's presented today by Georgia's Own Credit Union. We're happy to have Georgia's Own Credit Union here, a part of Around the Doghouse on DawgNation Daily here today. And let me kind of remind you what we were talking about there a moment ago, that there's a lot of hype building around Georgia, and Kirby Smart's going to push back against some of that kind of hype, and he's going to challenge his team to stay as focused as ever. And a lot of this feels very familiar to the kinds of things you've heard from Georgia in the past, or really the kinds of things you've heard about a lot of championship contenders in the past. And what I said was, actually, when you look at 2021 comparison to 2022, not only do I believe that this Georgia team right now actually has a chance to be better than that Georgia team from a year ago, even though that Georgia team won the national championship, there is also something I believe about this Georgia team that makes it different than last year's team. And one of the things that I said is that if you go back and look at last year's national championship, there may have been a sense of relief when it was over. When you're trying to achieve a goal that your program hasn't achieved in more than 40 years, or Kirby Smart as a head coach has never achieved, when your players who've heard for a while you can't get over the Alabama hump, or somehow that Georgia's going to be a sort of woulda, coulda, shoulda type program that gets closed but doesn't ultimately get the cigar, there's a level of pressure that gets built into that maybe causes you to be wound a little bit tight. And maybe you grind more intensely day after day, week after week towards a goal. And when it's all said and done, maybe there's a sense of relief there, and maybe not this sense of elation that you assume would happen after a goal like that. Maybe you're just sort of glad the season's over and glad you accomplished your goal, but maybe it doesn't quite feel as sort of euphoric as you think it's kind of supposed to. Well, I said a moment ago, that's the kind of thing you can sort of only do one time. That you can be wound that tightly and that intense one time, but that can't be a permanent state of being. And I think you see some evidence here right now. This Georgia team is, instead of being relieved when the season's over the way they may have been last year, I think you see a sense of relaxation stepping into this Georgia team here right now. Not in terms of how it goes about its business during practice or outplays the games, but in terms of the mindset that it approaches. I told the story yesterday with John Stinchcomb on the air. And I was standing next to the Georgia locker room on Saturday when the touchdown was scored that allowed South Carolina to get some points. And I said, when you watch some of those support staffers who were kind of, in the business of kind of working around and kind of preparing the locker room for the Georgia players to return, there was this immediate sense of disappointment. And it was like a really palpable sense of disappointment of all of a sudden it just sort of felt like, wow, Georgia's losing this game based on this feeling here right there. That's how disappointed those guys were that Georgia gave up some points. And that's a really cool edge that Georgia kinds of plays with, that a touchdown in a meaningless moment of a game, they're already winning 48-0, for them is just as intense as it is in the early stages of the game when the points for the opposing team would have really mattered a whole lot more. That's a cool statement about how edgy Georgia plays the game with. But then when the Georgia players all came back to the locker room, and I had to stand there and wait because I was trying to get on the field to do the post-game show, while there was this disappointment, Jeff Sentell had taken some pictures of players on the field too, and you could tell the look on their face. They were so mad when South Carolina scored. Y'all, that didn't stop them from celebrating the game. They were mad in the moment when the touchdown scored, but when the game was over, they were back to celebrating and patting each other on the back and congratulating each other. Players were doing this with players. Coaches were doing this with players. This, to me, looks like a Georgia team that's just having fun right now. And I think that's one of the things that's making this team different than maybe some previous versions of Georgia football that you've seen before, is they're really inserting fun into this. Obviously, the games are fun to watch because of how the offense is moving down the field and how aggressive the defense is playing there as well. But there are a couple of other specific moments where Georgia also just seems to be having a lot of fun, or understanding that fun is a part of the process here, that you've got to create the kind of program that coaches want to play for and players want to be a part of and play in. Look no further than the Oscar Delp touchdown on Saturday. People know the backstory here. Delp was a recruit who could have gone to South Carolina, and South Carolina probably pushed for Delp as hard as anybody's going to push for any one recruit, because Delp's mom had been a South Carolina grad, had been a big Gamecock fan. This was the kind of battle, even over a powerhouse like Georgia, that South Carolina thought it could win. And yet Georgia recruited Oscar very, very hard in its own right, ultimately won that recruiting battle. And knowing that Delp is playing on Saturday against his mom's alma mater, the school that he almost went to, whether it was intentional or not, it certainly appeared to be, Georgia made sure to get that Oscar Delp touchdown for him on Saturday. And there's a great scene of Kirby congratulating Delp and the message seems unmistakable there of, hey, we wanted to take good care of you in this game because we know you could have gone there. That's just kind of a fun thing, right? It's the kind of thing where Georgia seems to be really easily understanding the mindset that players approach with. That, hey, if I'm a guy like Oscar Delp, I'm coming to a school at Georgia where there's a lot of talent in this tight end position. There's a lot of depth here that could keep me off the field. Am I making the right choice for me? Is this going to be a fun experience for me? Well, getting a chance to score a touchdown against South Carolina is an example of, yeah, you know what? They are making sure I'm having a good time. And even in the midst of grinding hard towards another championship, there is still a sense we're going to stop and kind of have a good time in this process. I think Amarius Mims is another example of that too. Mims spoke to reporters yesterday and talked about the decision to almost leave UGA. The fact that he visited a place like Florida State, but ultimately realized that Georgia is the right place for me. Well, guess what? Right now, Amarius Mims is playing a good bit for Georgia, even though he technically isn't a starter here. And you typically haven't seen a lot of rotating with offensive linemen the way that Georgia's rotating these offensive linemen right now. But that's the kind of thing that Georgia's doing, because for a guy like Mims, who could have gone and played somewhere else but chose to stay at Georgia, hey, let's make sure, this is seemingly what Georgia's saying here, let's make sure we reward him for that decision and let him have some fun by getting a chance to play. Pretty soon he's going to be in the NFL, but while he's waiting his time here at Georgia and playing behind a Broderick Jones or a Warren McClendon, let's also make sure it's fun for him there too. I told John Stinchcomb this yesterday. I'm going to tell all of you this right now too. It is a very interesting balance that I think is that Georgia's striking right now. On the one hand, while they're playing, they seem as intense as ever, even late in the game, in games in which they're on their way towards a blowout win. But on the other hand, they also seem to be sort of stopping and appreciating the moment, maybe more so than ever, getting Delp a touchdown, giving playing time to guys like Amarius Mims, making sure this experience of being a part of another run towards a championship is as fun as it was supposed to be. Last year's response to a title may have been relief. They may have been kind of just glad it was over and that the mission got accomplished. This year, knowing that this is kind of the new normal for Georgia, being in the championship pursuit, maybe for many years to come, maybe a little bit more relaxed, maybe stopping to appreciate it and enjoying it more. And if that's true, I think that could be bad news for the rest of college football as Georgia settles into a very comfortable zone here right now. That is Around the Doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. We're, of course, happy to have them as a part of what we're doing here. And I know this time of year, so many of you are traveling around and doing so many things. Going to Columbia on Saturday, or maybe you're heading towards Columbia, Missouri, coming up on October 1st. A lot of travel when it comes to college football right now, or just a lot of things that you're buying this time of year. Well, the things that you're buying, the things that you're doing, you can make all of that much more enjoyable and get a lot of great benefits when you use one of those Visa, Signature, or Platinum cards from our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. And when you do so, you're going to get all kinds of flex rewards given back to you, which can be basically used for anything. Gift cards, cash back, travel, merchandise, so much more. You can also earn up to $150 when you open a new Platinum or Signature card. Now, there are some restrictions that apply, so make sure you check out the website. That is georgiasown.org for more details, georgiasown.org. But make sure you check it out online, the Visa, Signature, Platinum cards from our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. All right, we're happy to have you here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll have more on the Dogs on the field with our buddy Connor Riley later on. We'll get a quick preview of also some of the Week 4 action around the SEC coming up there as well. But for now, a guy that knows this program very well and a guy who I'm sure is enjoying the 3-0 start the Dogs have gotten themselves off to. He's going to be our guest here on Tuesdays, and we're happy to have him with us. It is former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And happy to say hello to Jake Fromm, Georgia quarterback, former Georgia quarterback, guy who knows Kirby Smart well, knows this program well, and I'm sure as much as the rest of us, he's enjoying what Georgia's kind of gotten off to here this year. Jake, thanks for being here. We're excited about having you on the show here on a regular basis, and I guess let's just sort of start with that right there. What did you think of Georgia on the field on Saturday and the level of dominance through 3 games that Georgia's showing right now?
Yeah, Brandon, what's up, man? Great to be here. Thank you for having me. Super excited going into this fall. Being a regular on the show, it's going to be awesome. As far as the Dogs, man, it just I said it earlier in the week. It just looks like they're playing a different game than everyone else. It's just unbelievably dominant. It is just awesome to see as a Dog fan. This is awesome. Hopefully they can keep it up. I think they will. It looks like they're playing Because nobody thinks they can do it again, and hopefully they can and keep going and growing off of it. But, man, for a defense to basically in reality not give up a touchdown for the first 3 games of the year, that is unbelievable to me. It is awesome. Keep making comparisons back to last year with the defense. Are they better? We don't know. I mean, the number 1 and number 2 defense haven't given up a touchdown in 3 games. That's incredible.
And the other thing I think I've noticed here is it just seems like they're having fun. I mean, obviously, and you could speak to this as much as anybody, we know it's not easy playing Georgia football. The practices are a grind. That Kirby and his assistants ask a lot from you guys who are in the program, and that can be kind of tough. But somehow, some way, this team seems to embrace that hard work, and they're also kind of finding a way to enjoy themselves during the games. You see a lot of smiles. You see a lot of pats in the back. They seem pretty connected together. That I think emotionally right now, the thing that Georgia may be doing at more of an impressive level than anything is they're finding a way to strike the right balance between staying as intense as Kirby wants them to be without making that kind of a burden to be around. I think that's not an easy needle to thread, but it seems like right now Georgia's doing a pretty good job of doing that.
I would definitely agree. I think it is a tough needle to thread, but you said a great word. I think they're embracing it because they saw the fruits of their labor happen last year. Hey, man, look, the practices, they are sucky. Tuesday and Wednesday are not fun, especially for those big boys in the trenches and the linebackers and the running backs and tight ends. It's a grind. Receivers, man, they run an incredible amount of yardage on the GPS trackers. They're running. Their bodies wear out. But that's the best part about his recruiting classes and bringing guys in, and guys can rotate in. But them embracing the grind, it paying off at the end of last year, and so they know, hey, it's going to pay off for us. And winning, man, winning makes it fun. It takes care of a lot of things, and it's definitely fun, even more fun, blowing people out the way that.
I want to talk to you about Stetson Bennett. I'm curious of your opinion on him. There are a lot of people going to say, oh, well, Bennett's performing, better right now than he has in the past. Maybe that's the case. If that is indeed true, like what differences do you see in Bennett here in 2022 compared to last year? And obviously down the stretch, last year he played at a very high level for Georgia there as well. But this is a guy that's putting up very big numbers right now and seems to just be in control of everything. What are the differences you're seeing in Bennett now compared to maybe the Stetson that we've seen in the past?
Well, first off, I mean, Stetson's a vet. He's been there. He's done that. He's going into his 6th, 7th year. He's a vet. He's got all that experience coming in. And then also during the off season, during the summer, during training camp, he was the guy. He got the reps. And so what you're seeing is the offense firing on all cylinders a lot faster because Stetson got those reps, and it's paying off for him. Munkin's getting into the bag of tricks a little early, especially in the South Carolina game, a few reverses, getting Brock involved, pop pass here, and nakeds, and it's looking good. It's really fun to watch, moving the pieces around because you can just put everybody on a board, spin the dial, and say, okay, all right, cool, it's Brock's week this week. Let's develop a plan for him. Spin it again next week. All right, it's Darnell. Spin it again, it's Ladd. So they have so many pieces, so many different guys to use, and it makes it fun, and you get to be creative.
Do you think it's realistic that Stetson Bennett can win the Heisman Trophy this year?
If he keeps doing what he's doing, I don't know how they can't give it to him. It's he's efficient, and he's putting up numbers. One, throwing the ball. He's getting the rushing touchdown. I don't know how you can't give it to him. And if they don't give it to him, it wouldn't be justice. They wouldn't be doing it right because he's doing. If he can keep up on the pace he's doing, I don't know how they don't give it to him.
Isn't that amazing, Jake? Because, and you understand the history of all this probably as well as anybody does because you've been in the spot, but you also grew up in the state. You just get all of that. That he's kind of gone from being a good story, hey, former walk-on, who maybe no one kind of expected this to happen for, all of a sudden now he's just a good player. And he is, as Kirby Smart said after the game on Saturday, a tough player to game plan against because, he's had, more than 250 yards passing in every game this year. He's had, in excess of 300 yards passing more often than not going back to the end of last season. And yet, in addition to that, he's also providing at least a rushing touchdown per game there as well.
Yeah,
he's actually becoming a pretty tough guy to game plan against. He's a lot more than just the former walk-on who's kind of a cool story. He's a lot more than that now, isn't he?
Oh, yeah. No, the development, Stetson, the mailman, Bennett, it just keeps getting better. Coming in to walk on, being a great scout team quarterback, being a good teammate, plays with a ship, and then now he's playing at a super high level. And I mean, let's be real there. Bryce Young won the Heisman last year, and if we're comparing apples to apples here, I mean, Stetson is as tall or taller than Bryce. He's bigger, he's faster. I think as far as getting out of the pocket and moving, I'm taking Stet in a race every single day of the week. So if we're comparing apples to apples, I mean, what does Bryce have that Stetson doesn't have? If we're being honest about this.
No, I think that's a very strong take. I do. You mentioned Brock Bowers a moment ago, and listen, I don't mean this in any way to disrespect the guys that are catching the ball for Georgia because they obviously have a lot of deep weapons right now. I just think that Brock Bowers is a different level of player. I think he has the look of the kind of guy I could see being drafted in the top 10 of the draft in a couple of years. You obviously see the 13 touchdowns that he had last year, and this was his kind of first breakout moment here of this year. But to me, Jake, Brock just plays the game at a totally different level than almost anybody else, and maybe anybody else in college football. How impressed are you with what Brock Bowers can do on a regular basis?
Yeah, you can see the intensity, the focus that he brings to the field. When he has the ball in his hands, he's running like a wild man. You just cannot bring me down. And he's as fast or faster than half or most of the DBs that we're playing against. So he's bigger, he's stronger. I think he has a great football IQ. He understands space. He understands body control. And in the great hand-eye coordination, made a great shoestring catch last game in South Carolina on a naked, reaches down, catches it, and then not only did he catch it, he then proceeds to get upfield and get some yards after the catch. So he is an unbelievable player without the ball in his hands, blocking, getting open, and then when the ball is in his hands, be my guest and try to bring him down. But it's proven a lot harder than most would think.
I want to finish with this because this is something you definitely have some experience with. When you guys beat Notre Dame in 2017, you went on a run after that, to your credit, where you didn't play a close game again for quite some time. Blew out Mississippi State, you ran through Tennessee, Florida, teams like that. You get the sense this Georgia team may be in a similar situation right now where, at least based on our projections of a lot of these games, Georgia may not play a close game for a while. How easy is it to maintain focus when you're maybe not being challenged week to week? Obviously, you guys ran into a little bit of a buzzsaw at Auburn back in November of 2017 and bounced back after that. But do you worry at all about this Georgia team maintaining its level of focus, knowing that they may not play a close game here for a while?
I think the hardest thing that people take, the level and the discipline to have that focus and intensity mentally as well as physically, but mentally for these younger kids who don't have the experience or new younger guys playing throughout the entire length of the schedule for 12 football games. And it's college football. You see it with App State. App State beat Texas A&M, and Georgia Southern beat Nebraska, and all these different upsets. So there's always the chance there. Now, Georgia, we're going to hit it soon. Kentucky's got a good football team right now. Tennessee's got a good football team right now. Florida, depending on the day, can be a tough football team. So they'll find out. They'll hit it. And to me, as long as they maintain that level of discipline and focus going into each and every week, I think they're going to be tough to beat.
Jake, it is so nice to have you on the show. Your voice in Georgia football obviously resonates so much, and we're big fans of yours. So thank you for being here. We'll look forward to getting a chance to speak to you next Tuesday. Enjoy your week, and we'll look forward to seeing the Dogs back in Athens on Saturday.
Yes, sir. Let's do it, Brandon. Thank you.
Good stuff.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I just think it's so valuable to have a player like Jake who played for Kirby Smart and played at a high level and was a part of, and we talked to Jake about this before, one of those foundational teams. Like 2017, I don't know that you get 2021 without 2017. I think that helped lay the foundation for what happens after that. And when he speaks about what's going on, he speaks with a lot of authority. So really good stuff from Jake Fromm there on that. We'll talk to Connor Riley as well here coming up in a moment. What happened in Athens yesterday, preparations for Kent State, the hype building around Georgia. We'll cover all of that with Connor here coming up in a moment. Before that, though, let's go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and remind you it's about time for you to be on board with us, hopefully. Independence of the Seas, that's where we're going to be in April. But in addition to that, I'm going to be on Wonder of the Seas coming up in December. Really excited about that, kind of an inaugural type sailing there as that repositions itself to Port Canaveral. And one of the things that I love is, and this is true for like the DawgNation cruise coming up in April or whatever else, I love having a port like Port Canaveral that's so close. Because the honest truth is, I'm not against air travel necessarily, but if I can take an easy drive just past Orlando and get to the port, that's really what I'm going to do. And so for all of the cruises that I currently have booked and upcoming, all of those are going out of Port Canaveral. It's a wonderful port. It's really easy to get to. My family, we drive to Orlando a lot anyway, so head on down just a little bit further than that, just about an hour down the road, and you are right there at Port Canaveral, and you can hop on board. And by the way, as I said before, the largest cruise ship in the world, Wonder of the Seas, is about to be in Port Canaveral. You've got Mariner of the Seas. You've got Independence of the Seas, which we're going to be on. Just incredible collection and an array of choices when it comes to our friends from Royal Caribbean right there in Port Canaveral, including this upcoming April 24th is when we're sailing the second ever cruise with DawgNation. If you go to the website, royaldogs.com, you can find out more details about that, about the itinerary, the big draft party we'll have on that Thursday night, the other special DawgNation events, because that's the thing. You'll hear me talk to you all the time about how great a Royal Caribbean cruise is, but a Royal Caribbean cruise with DawgNation is even better. So royaldogs.com to find out more about that, or our friend Jessica Slater. You can just give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. If you're ready to book your cruise, go ahead and do that. If you've just got questions about the process, well, she'll answer that for you there too, about why this is going to be such a great experience. And don't forget, if you book between now and September 30th, you get that $100 onboard credit to use on shore excursions, on drinks at the bar, specialty restaurants, merchandise, whatever else. The $100 onboard credit is yours for use on the cruise if you book between now and September 30th. So make sure you get going on all of that. Let's also talk about some of the big games here of the weekend, kind of an early preview of what Week 4 around the SEC is going to look like. And I think that there are probably one kind of dominant theme for the two big SEC games of the weekend. And the simple question is this as easy to predict as it looks? Because I think for a lot of people, you're going to see Tennessee hosting Florida. Tennessee has really played well, although not against the stiffest competition through its first three games. Florida got the big win against Utah and has not looked good since then, really, even though they are 2-1 on the year. Is it as simple as saying that Tennessee in its own stadium with game day there, probably biggest atmosphere and environment we've had in Knoxville in quite some time, is it just easy to assume that they have a little bit of a coronation by beating up on Florida, a team that's given them a ton of grief over the years? And is this just sort of the arrival of Tennessee as a little bit of a factor in the national conversation and maybe the most prominent threat to Georgia in the SEC East? Is it that simple? I think that's still to be determined as the week goes on. I do think the one thing you've seen from Tennessee is, from a position group standpoint, on the list of best position groups in the entire conference, you have to include Tennessee at wide receiver. They really do have a great collection of talent at the wide receiver position, and there may be some question about the program overall, but in terms of what they do at the passing game to get those wide receivers activated, they are, clearly pretty strong in all of that. And is there any kind of rise up last gasp from Florida after almost being embarrassed by South Florida, after really, getting beaten up by Kentucky there a little bit? Any rise up from Florida there at all? I think that's one of those things we'll talk about as the week goes on. Another game, kind of a similar storyline, although a little bit different point spread situation, in Jerry World, Texas A&M against Arkansas. Now, keep in mind here that Arkansas is the team that, although they weren't great against Missouri State on Saturday, this team that's been sending a pretty strong message a lot throughout the season here thus far. A&M sending the opposite message. They can't score points. Even in beating Miami on Saturday, it's a little bit ugly. But to open the week, they were a slight point spread favorite against Arkansas. So this is one of those things where you wonder, does the narrative change here? Does A&M finally assert itself here this season? Or is this an example of Arkansas saying, we're actually making our claim right now to be clearly, without question, the second best team in the SEC West? I think Arkansas, Texas A&M, on an otherwise kind of light week, is actually a pretty good game on Saturday and worth your attention. I think the Brian Harsin era at Auburn is hanging by a string. I don't think they'll lose to Missouri at home on Saturday. That'd be pretty wild and pretty awful if that were the case. But one way or another, at this point in time, Harsin is just kind of in a lame duck session as the Auburn coach, and we'll see when that comes to an end. I would say he's one loss away from getting fired whenever that finally occurs. Vanderbilt, after getting 3 wins in the non-conference late in September, as Jim Ross would say, business picks up in a big way this upcoming Saturday when they take on Alabama. Although interesting to see former Atlanta area quarterback A.J. Swan kind of emerging there for the Commodores after really Mike Wright had a pretty impressive run to begin the year. Swan kind of came on Saturday, so that's a little bit interesting and probably worth your attention there as well. There is a lot of dreck in the SEC this week too, and I guess Georgia-Kent State's kind of a part of that. But at least a couple of games. Florida-Tennessee, worth your time. A&M, Arkansas, I think worth your time there as well. Other than that, not easy to sell the slate in the SEC this week. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And while I can't really sell you on this week's SEC games too well, I can certainly sell you on some more good Georgia football information. And that's what we get right now with Connor Riley as a part of a Kroger, easy for me to say, a part of a Kroger Fresh Take with him. Connor, welcome into the program. We're happy to have you here. You know, Georgia 3-0, dominant win against South Carolina coming up on Saturday. And I think a lot of folks wonder, okay, well, where does it go from here? No game of consequence this week with Kent State coming in and maybe not really challenged in the foreseeable future of the next few weeks. What was the mindset you found around Athens yesterday, hearing from Georgia coach Kirby Smart and the players that you spoke to as well?
You know, B.A., you and I had sort of even talked about this before the game on Saturday. People want to, start making the comparison of, is this team better than last year? That was a popular question asked around at media days yesterday. And quite frankly, I'm already past that island. That take island is crowded with the usual people. I think this Georgia team can be every bit as good as 2019 LSU or 2020 Alabama with the way that they have been playing so far. It does not matter the opponent you put in front of them. They are annihilating them. Oregon picked up a great win over BYU this past weekend, which I'm sure you touched on yesterday.
Yeah.
And they made Oregon look just as hapless as Samford did. Ironically, of the teams Georgia has played so far, their smallest margin of victory is against Samford. And so I think that speaks to just the hunger and the will that this team has. Jake Fromm mentioned earlier, it seems like this team is playing a different sport. I don't know about going that far because the NFL, I think we're probably 2-3 weeks away from wondering which hapless NFL team could Georgia beat. This team is just so locked in and focused right now, and I think, the comparison shouldn't be made to last year. I think with the way this team has played so far, the comparison should be to the other great recent teams of the 21st century, because that is where Georgia has very clearly put itself through the first 3 weeks of the season.
And one of the things I've kind of made a little bit of a theme on today's show is that while their destruction of the 3 teams they played thus far has been brutally efficient, I don't think it's been joyless, Connor. I think there's a very 2022 vibe that Georgia's giving off right now. I think that Kirby Smart very well understands the nature of the transfer portal and very well understands the nature of coaches could leave and go take jobs other places, that they are finding a way to be like just, violently efficient in terms of how they're winning these games, but also as a twin pillar to that, they seem to be having some fun while doing it, and they're getting a lot of guys involved, and that there is this connection that seems to be forming that Kirby Smart talks about a lot. I don't think he's being empty when he's saying those kinds of things. I do find it really interesting that this team right now, I would say, appears to be having more fun than maybe the 2021 team was having, and I think that matters.
Well, and this is what that championship buys you. There's not the 1980 sort of jokes or thoughts, or is Georgia ever going to get over the hump? How does Georgia stack up against Alabama? That's what that win buys you. It buys you the peace of mind, knowing, hey, this team can go out there and potentially do it. We've seen it happen in our lifetime. And so while, yes, this is a new team, it is a different team than the one we have seen ago. I think you can unequivocally say that through the first 3 games of the season. Having that national championship experience and winning it, I think, has brought not just this team a sense of ease, and you're seeing that play out on the field, but the fan base as well. I mean, they just go in there and bludgeon South Carolina to the point that, at halftime, those student benches had emptied out there in
Yeah.
Williams-Brice Stadium. And so I think that just as much, the fact that Georgia is seen as a juggernaut, not just within its own fan base, but other fan bases as well, I think makes this experience that we're having right now all the more enjoyable.
I think that's right. And on the defensive side here, when you think about, virtual shutouts, obviously they did score late. The Samford game was a shutout, only giving up 3 points to Oregon. When the standard is that level of perfection where, virtually any points or yards being yielded is kind of considered a loss, I think that caused you to kind of reconsider the dominance of Georgia on the defensive side even more, because the truth is regardless of who you play, and I think the Oregon team has sort of shown itself to be a really quality win for Georgia based on what they've done since then. But when you look at the way in which they're going out there and just completely throttling their opponents, ending all hope on the defensive side of the ball, I think that's the kind of thing that stands up regardless of who you've played.
If you want a perfect distillation of what this defense is, I encourage you to go to the DawgNation YouTube page and watch the interview I did with Nolan Smith on Saturday. There was a moment there where I essentially asked the same question that you had just asked. What have you seen from this defense so far where you've essentially given up one garbage time touchdown, and the starters, and I use starters in air quotes here as I'm about to explain, haven't given up a touchdown yet and really haven't even given up very many points. And Nolan snaps might not be the right word, but he very clearly corrected me and said, no, if you're on the field, you're a starter for this team. And so he was very upset that Georgia had given up a touchdown late in the fourth quarter of that game. The standard is we don't want teams in our end zone. And I think you're seeing that standard bear out because, a few years ago, or even last year when Georgia was up big in these games and you were getting, Jamon Dumas-Johnson reps, Zion Logue reps, Nas Stackhouse reps, Kamari Lassiter reps. When those guys were late in the game, you think back to the Kentucky game, the Missouri game, the Florida game, where they had late defensive stands in that game and a chance to keep them out of the end zone. I think those processes have transferred over to these guys as they've gotten older, and they've carried that along with them. And that has helped solidify what this defense continues to be. So when, Marvin Jones Jr., Darius Smith, Dalen Everett, when those guys become first team on the field guys later on in their careers, they're still going to carry this thought, these feelings of, hey, remember back against South Carolina when they scored a late touchdown against us? Let's make sure we keep them out of the end zone once again. And I think that standard, which has taken years to build, is finally sort of shown out in what it is and is now sort of an endless loop of what to expect from the Georgia defense.
So let me ask you this. I think people have a tendency to kind of put every sort of non-Power 5 team in the same category, but Samford and Kent State are very different teams. I'm not saying Kent State's a world beater by any stretch, but this team did play in the MAC title game a year ago. They were one of the higher scoring teams in the country last year. Admittedly, I don't know if their offense is anywhere near, that good this year. They played a crazy schedule at Washington, at Oklahoma, now at Georgia, so they're clearly making themselves a lot of money by going on a little bit of a barnstorming road trip here. What would you say? Sell me on the game on Saturday. What are you watching for? What do you think fans should be watching for? If it's nothing, I guess just be honest about that. But is there a point of emphasis for you in the game on Saturday against Kent State?
The transitive property is always tricky, and the fact that this is the third sort of Power 5 a team that they're going to play on the road might make this a little bit more interesting. But, they played Oklahoma relatively tough there for a stretch, 33-30, or 33-3, was the final score when they played in Norman. Washington, which picked up a very nice win against Michigan State, 45-20 there. Comparatively, what does Georgia do to Kent State on Saturday? How Oklahoma, a potential playoff team, how Washington may be the best, a front runner to be a contender in the Pac-12 there. How does Georgia go about showing off what it can do against the Kent State team? Because if it goes out there and it absolutely throttles Kent State in the way it has Oregon and South Carolina, I think when you stack that up to what Oklahoma and Washington did, two probably top 20 teams in the country this season, certainly based on talent, I think that's just going to add another measuring stick to what Georgia has had so far. And it's non-conference slate. You go out there, you get a win over a top 15 Oregon program. You get a win over a South Carolina team I think is still going to be able to go to a bowl game this year and do some nice things. I think, obviously it is a tougher sell. It's a home game, so come have fun at that. You only get, I think, 7 of them this year, maybe 6. So it is a tougher sell, but I'll say this. Going on the road against Missouri next week, that might be an even tougher sell because I think Missouri might be every bit as bad as Kent State is with the way they've played so far. So Georgia's schedule, you look out, Auburn, not very good right now. Brian Harsin might not even be coaching when they come to Athens October 8th. Vanderbilt, weirdly, I've liked what they've done so far. They're the highest scoring team in college football so far this season. But I don't think any of us expect that to be a game there. So this next real month for Georgia, it's going to be how do they stack up against themselves, because really the opponents they're going to see on the field, I don't think can hold a candle to them.
I want to do two quick things before we let you go. Let me first remind folks, though, this is our Kroger Fresh Take with Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily here today. And, of course, I want you to check out our friends at Kroger when it comes to Kroger Chef Jr. This is a great guided kids cooking experience that gives you a chance to let your kids learn more about food preparation. I think it's always easier to get them to eat healthy when they're a part of that preparation process. And that's really what Kroger Chef Jr. is all about there as well, including this month making some of those lettuce wraps, which is kind of a cool thing to make. And, of course, this upcoming Saturday, September 24th, you get to be a chance to be a part of that at a select Kroger location. So when you do, it's just $7 per child, and in addition to making the food item, which this month is the lettuce wrap, you're also going to get an apron and a patch, a chef's hat, a recipe card and box, and a whisk. It's all just $7 per child. So check out Kroger Chef Jr. For a lot more on that. KrogerChefJr.com, I should say, for more on that. KrogerChefJr.com. All right, so Connor, I guess let me do this here really quickly. Two quick things. You mentioned the potential historic nature of this Georgia team if it continues on the same path that it's on right now. Doesn't a lot of that right now center around the quarterback position, where if you really are going to throw the ball as well as Georgia is right now, Stetson's been over 280 yards in every game thus far this year and has regularly thrown over 300 yards in the years prior to, or I should say in the games prior to that. If that's what you're doing, and you're adding that to the defense that Georgia already plays, that's kind of the recipe for how you get to sort of that kind of historic level of team in the category of what you put them in kind of before 2019 LSU or maybe 2020 pandemic Alabama. That's kind of how you would get to that for Georgia here right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, stylistically, I certainly think they're up there. They're doing, I think, what LSU did a season ago. I know we talked on Saturday during the game, how many great players does this Georgia team have on the offensive side of the ball? I think Brock Bowers is obviously in that category. I think Cedric Von Pron is in that category. I think Broderick Jones, sooner rather than later, is going to be in that category. But they have a lot of good guys who, on a certain day, could be great, but week in, week out, we don't really know that yet. Whereas, you look at that LSU team, they had Justin Jefferson, they had Jamar Chase, they had Joe Burrow. I think those guys all qualify as great. You look at that Alabama team, Mac Jones was great that year. Devontae Smith obviously won the Heisman Trophy. Jalen Waddle went healthy. Najee Harris, those guys were all great. So I think that, how many players by the end of the season are we unequivocally calling great players, I think is going to be one thing to determine it. The other one, and this is the one where if this happens, I think, and again, a lot has to happen, and this team is certainly going to get better than what they have shown so far this season. But there's a world out there where Georgia plays Alabama twice this season, and there's a world out there, I believe, where Georgia can beat Alabama twice this season. And if that does happen, boy, it's going to be a fun time on DawgNation Daily.
Oh, yeah.
Because, they've beaten them once, and so fear is not the right word to use, but there's sort of an uneasiness in the past of playing Alabama. I'm not sure that exists anymore, certainly in the scale that it did beforehand. And I'm not talking so much from a player standpoint, but from a larger fan base perspective at large here. You beat them in the SEC championship game. You're going to be the number one seed, and you're going to play in Atlanta, and you're going to play in that first college football playoff game, and I do think that's going to be a tremendous benefit to you. And then two, I still think there's a very good chance you could see Alabama again in the national title game, even if they do lose to Georgia in the SEC championship game. And if you beat them again in the national title game, in addition to beating them in the SEC championship, and then again last year in the national championship game, that's an all-time run against a program that has been the measuring stick in college football for a decade plus now. And so I think if you're looking for a path for Georgia to get to that LSU, that Alabama sphere in terms of recent seasons, it's 2 wins over Alabama. And how many offensive players graduate from the level of good player to truly great player?
Now, let me finish with this, and you kind of lead me into it, which is through 3 weeks, Georgia is really, in my mind, the only national story. But that's not going to last. I mean, pretty soon, someone else asserts themselves. Maybe it's, USC against Oregon State this week, or maybe it's Ohio State against Wisconsin. Maybe it's Clemson against Wake Forest. Tell me your thoughts on how quickly the national landscape changes where someone asserts themselves in a similar way to which that Georgia has through these first 3 games? And do you have a sense of who that's going to be? Maybe it's Bama as they get more into conference play on the other side of Vanderbilt here this week. But who do you think is next on the national landscape to truly assert themselves?
I think USC is certainly a team that's worth watching right now. They've won and covered in all 3 of their games. Their offense is obviously incredibly potent. Their defense is very reliant on turnovers right now, and at some point that luck just happens to run out, and I'll be interested in seeing how they play when they don't get these sort of turnovers they force there. I think Michigan is a team worth watching now. The schedule they've played might be one of the worst in the country, but they are doing what good teams should and absolutely blowing those teams out. They get Maryland on the road this week, which they should beat Maryland, but I'll be interested in seeing how they go about doing it. And then I believe on October 1st they go to Iowa, and Iowa's offense, I think there are some Georgia high school teams out there that might have more talent than Iowa does on that side of the ball. But at Iowa, against that defense, I think is going to be a real measuring stick game. And so if Michigan's 5-0 on October 1st and they look good in these next 2 weeks, I think you're going to see maybe a lot of people circling Georgia and Michigan as the 2 teams out ahead. And that's more so because of the schedule and the way that Michigan has looked so far. I think Ohio State's going to have a chance to get there, and I obviously think Alabama is as well, though the SEC West, I'm not as high on that division as I was maybe a week ago after what Arkansas looked like this past weekend, what Texas A&M continues to look like there. So I do think from a schedule standpoint, I think Michigan is well positioned right now to sort of be that number 2 team that it sends up in the polls.
All right, Connor, good stuff. We'll look forward to reading more from you there at DawgNation.com. We appreciate your time here as part of our Kroger Fresh Take today. And as I said before, we'll read a lot from you and hear from you again very soon as well.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
So Connor and I touch on something kind of interesting there at the end of the conversation there. And there's, a level of Georgia fan that's still somewhat uncomfortable being this much in the spotlight, being talked about this much. And we kind of, sort of played the Peter Burns audio off the top of the show. Like some of this just seems like ludicrously exaggerated. And for some Georgia fans, it just feels like a little bit of a turnoff. If that's the way that you feel and you kind of follow the college football stories, like eventually you're going to get more hype for other teams. And maybe it is Michigan, as Connor said. Now, I don't know how you sell Georgia Michigan again after Georgia throttled them a year ago. But eventually, Michigan's going to play some tougher games, and maybe they start to get that conversation. I think that Ohio State's going to turn on its offense a little bit on Saturday, and so maybe they kind of join the hype of the season a bit. There is clearly going to be a cottage industry being built around USC, but as Connor said, defensively, they haven't been all that great. They gave up actually a good bit of yards last week to a Fresno State. So, I don't know that I'm going to break my back, trying to lift USC to the sky right now. But eventually, someone's going to get some praise. Someone's going to join Georgia in the national conversation. The reason why it hasn't happened yet is because Ohio State kind of played around with Notre Dame and didn't get a convincing win. Alabama kind of played around with Texas, didn't get a convincing win. So those teams that could have been a part of the hype machine that Georgia's kind of part of now, they just didn't play well enough to do that. Eventually, somebody's going to start playing well, though. Maybe it's Bama, maybe it's Ohio State, maybe it's USC. I would keep your eye on Oklahoma a little bit right now, too. Clearly, I would say the class of the Big 12 at the moment, with all due respect to Kansas, but clearly the class of the Big 12. But somebody eventually is going to start getting some national attention. So if you feel like it's too much on Georgia right now, eventually some of this kind of slides over to somebody else. And interesting stuff from Connor there on all of that. Also, let me remind you about my friends at the Durham Law Group there as well. You hear them on game days with us here on DawgNation, and they also want to do good stuff for you there as well when it comes to facing a tough situation. Maybe you've been hurt or injured on the job or in an accident. My wife had a traffic accident the other day. Thankfully, she wasn't hurt, but you're reminded of how serious that can be for someone who does come away with an accident situation where they're a little worse than where, how challenging it can be sometimes to get what you feel like you deserve in a situation like that. Well, that's what the Durham Law Group is all about. And they work hard for you, and they make a promise to you that you'll get no fees or expenses from them unless you win. That's the commitment they make to you, which I think is really awesome. And so you can contact them for more information on that. The number 844-4GA-HURT. That's 844-4GA-HURT. You can also visit them online, GeorgiaHurt.com. That's the state spelled out, GeorgiaHurt.com. So check out the Durham Law Group here today. If you've been injured on the job, hurt in an accident, if you find yourself in need of being made right, of being made whole, let them do it for you, and they won't have any fees or expenses for you unless you win. All the more reason to call them 844-4GA-HURT or visit online, GeorgiaHurt.com. And for our golden shoe today, something we probably thought we'd never see, although at this rate, I think I may be on board on both sides of this equation. The idea that maybe the Falcons right now are going to tank for Stetson Bennett. Let me show you this from our buddy, Frustrated Falcons fan on Twitter, who says, motto for the season, tank for Stetson. Hashtag Dirty Birds, hashtag Go Dogs. This may indeed be the case here, and that may be what the Frustrated Falcons fans are sort of hoping for. If not Stetson Bennett, can they at least play Desmond Ridder, see what he has? Can you at least see what he brings to the table? But nonetheless, a lot of Frustrated Falcons fans right now wouldn't mind seeing a little Stetson Bennett under center. Maybe a little of that in the future for the Falcons there. We'll see if that is indeed the case. How about 5,003 days? That's how long it's been since the lousy, stinking Gators have won a national championship. That is fun to consider. Something else that's fun to consider, 39 days from right now, Dogs back in Jacksonville beating up on those lousy, stinking Gators again. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. Hashtag go for 2 in 22. We're all about that, and we'll see you tomorrow here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And don't forget, as you see the beautiful oil painting, the fantastic artist rendition of our good friend Eddie, the official mascot of DawgNation Daily, you can go to the top of the page there at DawgNation.com, click the link right at the top of the page, and you can get into the DawgNation store, and you can see the Eddie t-shirts in all varieties, the lousy, stinking Gators. You can let Florida know how you think about them. All kinds of really cool stuff there. A lot of folks have really enjoyed the Eddie t-shirt here thus far, and you can get one for yourself there as well. So make sure you check that out. DawgNation.store is the website, but the easiest thing to do is go to DawgNation.com because you're already there anyway, and just clicking the link there at the top. All right, so with that said, we'll dive in here and we'll get some of your comments. And we are happy to have you as a part of the show today. I think I started on Facebook yesterday, so let me start on YouTube here today. And we'll see how folks are doing over there. And hope you enjoyed Jake Fromm. Hope you enjoyed, I think, what is an interesting kind of comparison between, this team this year, team last year. I don't think there's any doubt. I said this on Saturday, that I think it's reasonable to say this team could be better than the one in 2021. But the mindset they have right now seems to be, I think, a really cool mindset, which I think is really cool. John White said, didn't get a chance to listen yesterday. Just want to make sure someone mentioned Lorenzo Carter making UGA look good again. You love seeing Lorenzo Carter with the Atlanta Falcons. That's a lot of fun. Raphael Wright on the subject of the story. I guess The Athletic had this the other day about Texas spending $280,000 on the Arch Manning official visit. That's a wild thing, man. That's a wild thing. Let's see what else. Green Soldier says, what team up north do you think makes it to the college football playoff? Also, this team is so much more balanced early on against Clemson. We had 4 or 5 offensive starters out, and JT was hurt. Yeah, I mean, right now the level of balance they're showing is really pretty remarkable. It is. As far as my playoff, last year we talked a lot about the possibility of 2 SEC and 2 Big Ten teams making the playoff, and maybe that was a year too soon, but that's been obviously a big topic of discussion here over the course of the last few months. And like the one team that I was talking about during the summer, I kind of find myself still kind of gravitating to a little bit of keep your eye on Oklahoma. I believe at some point in time USC is going to falter because that's just what Pac-12 teams do. So if you're looking for a non-Big Ten or non-SEC team to make the playoff, it's not a team up north necessarily, but a team that you would, I think, consider a part of that conversation right now, I'd keep my eye on Oklahoma a little bit. Lee Go Down says we still have a lot of work to do. No doubt that's the case. But here's the thing, is that, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, is that obviously Georgia's got work to do each and every day. And obviously, Georgia's going to grind towards getting that done. But they're also, as I said before, stopping to appreciate themselves too, having some fun along the way. They clearly were having a blast against South Carolina on Saturday. So I think the job for all of us is to kind of find a way to sort of strike the same mindset. Like, none of us are going to be at Georgia practice today. I don't even think any media is going to be there at all, I don't think. So whatever they're doing behind practice is happening behind closed doors. Like, honestly, I have no control over that, so therefore I'm not going to worry about that. But what I am going to try to do is try to make our show and our conversation as fun and as enjoyable as possible, because that's our job. Our job is to have an appreciation for what we're seeing, Our job is to enjoy this experience. However it ends, Stetson wins the Heisman, Georgia wins the national championship, Brock Bowers finally wins the Mackey Award, maybe in a crazy set of circumstances. Maybe that crazy thing might actually occur. Whatever happens, our job is just to sort of enjoy it. And that's what we're going to try to do around here. Greg Rosenberg on UGA recruiting. I get the impression we're still going to hear, look, it's not going to be Justice Haynes. It's not going to be Caleb Downs, but we're going to still hear from George in some key recruiting battles. I think that's a long way from being done. I do. Lee Godowns, this is a good point. He says, there's nothing wrong with enjoying working hard. Working hard makes you better. I think that's right, Lee. And that's what I think that George is doing so well. And I think you say that very well, too. I think that's what George is doing, is that anything is made enjoyable or more enjoyable if you like the people you're doing it with. And I really do think that's not just, puffery on the part of Georgia. They've talked about this a lot. I do really think they take the idea of what they call those skull sessions, those player meetings where they're hearing each other's stories a little bit. I think they take that stuff pretty serious, and I do think that stuff is really working for them. And that's how it is that working hard can be made more enjoyable, is you're working hard with people that you genuinely care about. And one of these wide receivers, a lot has been made lately of the blocking they've done for each other. Darnell blocking for Brock Bowers blocked for Landon McConkey. Landon McConkey's blocked for, on and on it goes. I think the reason why all that stuff works so well is because I think they genuinely want their teammates to score. Somehow they've kind of conjured that up. It's like we hear coaches talk about culture all the time, and it sort of almost sounds like sort of bumper sticker or fortune cookie style philosophy sometimes. It just all sounds so trite. But at Georgia, I do think the effort they've put into building culture, I think, is a big part of the story. I really do. Ace Dog. Big part of our DawgNation postgame show on Saturday, saying I really enjoyed chatting with you. You guys do Zoom about 2 or 3 times a week on this platform. He says we should do that. Yeah, maybe we will do that more. I think the problem with DawgNation Daily is the show's long enough already as it is, but we could find some more ways to do that. I think you're right. Jonathan Aaron says, out of Urban or Clown Mullen, who do you think would be a better fit for Lincoln? There's a part of me that almost thinks that Dan Mullen would have been an okay fit for Nebraska. I could see Mullen at Arizona State. I meant to ask Connor about Monk, and I should have. I forgot to do that. I could see Mullen coaching at a place where the expectation is not great recruiting. I could. I could see him doing that. I mean, you've heard me say this before. Mullen's dumb, but he's not stupid. He won some games at Mississippi State. He just couldn't make Florida into a power. He thought he could. He thought it was going to be easy, but he just clearly overestimated his own ability. But do you think that Mullen would be an awful coach at Arizona State compared to who they might hire? I don't think so. At Nebraska, maybe they would aspire to something a little bit higher and better than that. But it's not like Mullen's such a bad coach that he should never work again. And part of me wouldn't mind having him make fun of a little bit. I just don't think that he's a good fit for a place that takes itself seriously, competing for a championship. He's just not cut from that cloth. He's just not whatever enough to do that. But could he, lead Arizona State to an 8-4 season? Of course he could. And that'd be plenty for folks in Tempe. You get the impression. James F. says, where can I get a DawgNation shirt? Well, if it comes to Eddie the Blind Squirrel and Lousy Stinking Gators and maybe soon a hashtag go for 2 and 22, you can get that right there at the DawgNation.store. That's the website, DawgNation.store, or click the link at the top of the page at DawgNation.com. Let me go to Facebook for a moment, see how the folks over there are doing. On Facebook. And here we go. Boom. Chad Williams says that Auburn's put facility improvement projects on hold to raise NIL money. How many more facility improvements do they need to do? Doesn't it feel like they've had a facility improvement every year? I feel like they spent more money on facilities than anybody. So, I mean, this is something I've always kind of thought, is that like I've never understood the connection that some people make between like winning college football games and commercial real estate. I've never quite understood like how facilities, no pun intended, facilitate all that. I mean, obviously you have to have nice buildings, you have to things like that. But is there that big of a difference between like a B+ facility and an A+ facility in terms of how you win games? So maybe they should be spending more on NIL. I mean, they just need to be recruiting more, period. I mean, Auburn's recruiting footprint lately is about as big as a quarter, right? I mean, it extends, just past Lake Martin, about as far as their recruiting seems to go these days. Deshaun Allman says thoughts on Jermaine Burton. So I'm really trying not to trash Burton. I really am. I want to be respectful of him. I want to be I don't come out here and trash players. But this is an important narrative for Georgia. It is. It is. Nick Saban really flaunted the idea that a guy like Burton would leave Bama. I should say leave Georgia, go to Bama, because Bama is so much better at cultivating stats for its players than Georgia is. Now, there's still a lot of season left to go. Maybe Burton eventually is a better player for them than he's been thus far. He does have 2 touchdowns, but I mean he's just getting very little in the way of passing yards. And the Georgia players right now in this offense are really feasting. That to me, the Georgia offense looks like a really fun one to play in right now. And as of yet, we're not quite so sure what this Alabama offense looks like right now and how Burton fits into all of that. And so while I don't take any great joy or pleasure in, the fact that Jermaine Burton's thus far, I would say, not doing very well, it is an important narrative for Georgia. And it's the kind of thing that once again, there are moments in the last couple of years where Nick Saban has sort of thought himself to be cuter than he actually is, more smart than he actually is. And it's one thing to take a player like Jameson Williams off Ohio State. That's a program that has great wide receivers, first-round draft pick style wide receivers. And Williams was playing behind those guys. Well, taking him and making him be that at Alabama, okay, that's fine. He probably would have been that at Ohio State too. He just had other first-round picks ahead of him. But in Burton's case, Burton was playing at Georgia. It's not like he was some hidden talent that nobody had seen. We'd seen a lot of Burton on the field. He'd been targeted. He'd been he'd been playing a lot of games, and Burton was a good receiver. And the notion that you're going to take someone who was a good receiver and magically make him a great receiver because you have this just vastly superior offense. The Alabama offense just isn't that much better than the Georgia offense to be able to do that. So to me, that's an example of Nick Saban just sort of thinking he is a little cuter than he actually is. And look, when you had Steve Sarkisian as your play caller, you could maybe do a lot of different things. When you've got Bill O'Brien as your play caller, who I think is inferior to what Sarkisian was and inferior to what some of the guys prior to that were there as well, you're just not going to have this radical transformation. Burton may eventually play better for them, and there's a part of me that I guess, I don't know, I don't want to say I hope he does, but I certainly don't wish him ill. I don't. I don't wish bad things on Jermaine Burton. I just don't. But do I expect that people will notice the stats that he's put up thus far? I do expect they'll notice that. And is this transfer not doing well for Bama kind of good for Georgia? Admittedly, it kind of is. So that's as honest as I know how to be about that. Myra Herbert Bush says Bryce Young's not looking all that good. Yeah, I mean, it's also important to kind of note here is that Bama has a history of not playing well in certain parts of September. Like you can go back and look throughout the years where, they have some just kind of sleepwalk Septembers. Let's see. Let's go back. I mean, like last year would have been the Florida game where, they didn't. Let me see if I can just do this really, really quick. So if you go back and look, like last year, an Alabama team that eventually played for the national championship only beat Florida 31-29 in Gainesville. So that's an example of, at that point in time, we weren't quite sure how good Alabama was. Go back to 2020. You may not get a huge example of this other than the fact they played, the Ole Miss game. Remember that? In 2020, when they gave up 48 points to Ole Miss, the Ole Miss offense just moving the ball down the field, and we were left to wonder, gosh, is this Alabama team capable of doing anything? That's a team that eventually won the national championship, but against Ole Miss in 2020, they didn't look very good right then either. Go back to 2019. This is not a team that made the college football playoff, but once again in September against South Carolina, 47-23, kind of an ugly game for Alabama where there would have been some questions asked about the Crimson Tide right there. The 2018 season, I don't really remember quite as well, but you go back to like 2014, 2015, they had losses to Ole Miss in those years. So Alabama's story will eventually stabilize in October. They'll probably throttle Vanderbilt on Saturday. They'll kind of get into a conference slate where they'll be more motivated against Texas A&M. They'll be more motivated against Arkansas, where they'll have a little more juice, and eventually they'll probably start playing better. But what they're doing right now is kind of in keeping with what we've seen them do in the past. Brandon Griffin pointing out Branson Robinson. I thought Robinson looked pretty good on Saturday too. Hope to get a chance to see more of him, and maybe if these sort of blowout style games continue, we will get a chance to see more of that. But I thought that was pretty good. Oren Chile says, I don't fear Bama. We are better, and Nick knows it. I've talked before about what Nick Saban probably secretly thinks about Georgia. But in terms of being afraid of Alabama, I don't care when Alabama eventually does go on its run. They almost always do. I believe this year they will as well. But Oren, I think, is really right, which is that the mood has changed now where if Georgia and Alabama play in the SEC championship, Alabama could win. But there is zero reason for Georgia to be afraid. There is. And I'd say on the Alabama side, there's probably zero reason for Bama to be afraid of Georgia, because even as Georgia's building itself up right now, if this continues throughout the season, this is still an Alabama team that's been in a million tough spots before, a million big games before. I don't think either team should be afraid of the other. It's just simply a fair fight. But this notion, as it was kind of portrayed leading up to last year, that Georgia had to be in the back of its mind, wondering if it was good enough, wondering if it was capable, all of that really is in the past. And moving forward, Georgia doesn't have to think that at all. That both sides can think of themselves as a worthy combatant. And both sides can view this as the fair fight that it is. And it may be a fight that happens a couple of different times. And, maybe Georgia wins one of them, loses the other, and maybe it wins them both, whatever else. But, the days of having to be afraid of what you might encounter if you played Alabama, those are over. And trust me, if Georgia is marching through the regular season, kind of like going into last year's SEC championship, if Alabama shows some vulnerability, that'll be all the more reason for people to kind of like sort of hype it up even more. And Alabama will try to be selling itself on the nobody believes in you card and all that kind of stuff. I just don't know if any of that really matters or not. I mean, all of this comes down to it being the kind of game that Georgia could just win again. Absolutely. Let me see what James Crump says. I think he says that I was giving Alabama more. He says, I believe you're being a little more optimistic, Alabama, than you probably should this season. Maybe that's the case, but we've been through this a lot. I mean, this has happened a lot, including just last year. I do think week-to-week motivation is not as easy as it used to be. It's one of the reasons why I spent so much time on today's show kind of crediting Georgia for what it seems to be doing right now with edge intensity on the one hand and kind of relaxed appreciation for fun on the other. They seem to be doing both those things pretty well. I don't think you can grind yourself down to a nub every single Saturday. I don't think you can. Last year's Alabama team at times seemed pretty disinterested. Now, I don't think Nick Saban liked a lot of his players last year. At least he didn't like some of them. And maybe some of those guys are gone now. Maybe that makes it better. But honestly, at least one of the transfers he's taken has already kind of proven not to be working out too well either. So I think week-to-week motivation for them and probably a lot of teams is probably a little bit of a challenge. So it could be that maybe Alabama just isn't that team anymore. But I suspect that somewhere around October, in the month of October, they probably kind of emerge as being a little bit like the Alabama teams we're used to seeing. That's my expectation anyway. At DawgNation.com for a moment. Joe Garliardi says, what if Alabama just doesn't stabilize so much this time? What if the culture there has just fallen too far? Someone said this here the other day that they are a band of mercenaries, not a team. Saban has traded culture and stability and loyalty for short-term gain. I think all that's true. I do think that Saban's made some bad choices late in his career. I just do. I think you've heard me say it a million times, I think he traded the physicality that used to define his team for finesse. And I don't think that shows up every Saturday. I don't. It's one of the reasons why I never want Georgia to give up on, its line of scrimmage dominance. Even as it becomes more exciting with the passing game and more potent with the offense and continues to score these 40-plus points per game, I don't think you want to give up the physical component. I think that Alabama trended too far the other direction. They just kind of become a little bit of a soft team. I think that has cost him. I think that Saban has delegated a lot on the offensive side of the ball. And in doing so, you've lost some of the cultural DNA you used to have. And once again, everybody thought, Nick Saban, was against the transfer portal, but now he's going to use it better than anybody. Using it more than anybody is not the same thing as using it better than anybody. It's just not. And as I said before, there's at least one Bama transfer that's not working out at all right now. And I'm not talking about Jermaine Burton. And when you bring in guys from outside your program who don't reflect your culture, you are impacting your own culture, and not always in a very good way, sometimes in a very bad way. So I do think that Alabama has probably taken some cultural shortcuts in the last couple of years, and there could be a reckoning coming for them on that at some point. But this is still a really good football team. This is still a talented football team. And they are not going down this year without a fight. J. Bob says, well, averaging 3 quarters hurt Stetson Bennett's Heisman hopes. I don't think so, because he's not going to have the best passing numbers in the country anyway. Like C.J. Stroud's going to have better numbers no matter what, eventually, I believe. And Caleb Williams is going to probably sort of be propped up to have better numbers than that, too. We haven't really seen the Caleb Williams hype train leave the station yet, but eventually it's going to. So the case for Bennett win the Heisman Trophy is not having better numbers than the other guys. It's having good numbers to go along with being the quarterback on the best team in the country. That's why we say #go for 2 in 22, is because as Georgia goes on that path, that becomes the strongest argument for him. Whether it should or it shouldn't, that's just kind of the Heisman Trophy thing kind of works, is that only playing 3 quarters is not going to be as much of a factor as being the guy that throws the haymakers in the first and second quarter that sends these games into garbage time so quickly. That's what people are going to remember about Bennett. So if Georgia's playing well and dominating, and Bennett's a part of that domination early in the game, he's going to still be very much a big part of the story, whether his numbers are better than Stroud's or better than Williams, because likely they won't be, because those guys will just be eventually in offenses that just throw the ball a lot more. And maybe in the case of USC, in closer games late, and they have to do that. So I think that's probably how that goes. Let's see what else. Johnny Rick says, is it Tennessee or Kentucky as the toughest game left on our schedule? In comparison between the two, I'll still say Kentucky. I think that Tennessee may be a slightly better team than Kentucky is, but Kentucky is on the road, and you have to factor in that. I was not impressed with Mississippi State this past Saturday against LSU. I thought that was really kind of a down and disappointing moment for that program, but I still think on the road at Mississippi State provides a little bit of a challenge there as well. Dan in Arkansas says, limit the portal to the pre-spring time frame. There are portal changes coming. There are going to be portal windows now, and we haven't talked about that a ton yet, but like some of the guys that were in the portal have actually been removed from the portal, some reports have said, because they're going to have a new window that kind of exists post-national championship, pre-spring. I forget when the window is. And then a brief window on the other side of that there too. So we are going to see transfer windows this year. Matt Rukavina says, when Barstool refers to Stetson as Stequavius, you know he's getting serious hype. Yeah, it's amazing how that name's going to take it on for him. Alan A. says, is Laster doing okay? Kind of concerned. As far as I know, he's okay. I think he's okay. Georgia's a little bit banged up with Jalen Carter right now. Obviously still a little bit banged up with A.D. Mitchell. But as far as I know, Laster's okay. Let's get your final comments and we'll get out of here today. Back on Facebook again. Becky Rutledge on the subject of Todd Monken saying he's the highest paid OC in America, basically wondering about Monken's future. I mean, obviously I think a guy like Todd Monken would want to be a head coach again and probably will be a head coach again at some point in time. I don't think I see him leaving to go to Arizona State in the middle of the year. I think right now Arizona State has just been tarnished. Typically speaking, I would think of Arizona State is kind of an upper half Pac-12 job. It's not a better team than Utah, but I do believe it's a better job. I think it's a better job than both Stanford and Cal, better job than Oregon State, better job than Washington State. Probably not as better job than Arizona, probably not as good a job as USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, but it's probably the 5th best job in the Pac-12, right? Better job than Colorado. So I would say it's an upper half Pac-12 job. High school football in Arizona is actually way better than it used to be. They've got kind of like an SEC-style fan base. I mean, the West Coast version of that. Their fans come to games. They make some noise sometimes. They kind of a state school type vibe out there. So typically speaking, Arizona State would not be a bad job to be head coach for. But there are 3 things working against you right now. Arizona's got the specter of NCAA investigation hanging over their head. Remember, they allegedly hosted recruits during the pandemic dead period. And they're going to probably get treated pretty harshly on the basis of that, because I think they're going to have a little bit of punishment coming their way on that. Herm Edwards just wasn't a very good recruiter anyway, and so the talent base in the program is kind of depleted. And also, the Pac-12 is still kind of building itself up out of a hole after, I think, mishandling the pandemic situation in 2020. As a league, they just weren't, doing the right stuff. I don't think they handled that situation well as a league, and I think that all of the Pac-12 jobs were hurt because of that. Don't discount that as part of the reason that USC and UCLA are going to the Big Ten, because I think they see that sort of Pacific version college football damaged by the way in which the pandemic was handled. And so all of that works against Arizona State. So in a normal situation, when a guy like Todd Monken want to be head coach at Arizona State, maybe so. It's not a bad job at all. But given those 3 things that I just mentioned, especially the NCAA stuff and especially the West Coast football culture right now, that might be the thing that would cause Monken to sort of consider, maybe going somewhere else and maybe doing so at the end of the season. Being paid the money that he's paid is probably worth keeping his focus in place for the rest of this year. I sort of think that. Philip Jordan Wells also reminding us about some of the other benefits to being in Tempe. David Johnson, thanks for the kind words. Appreciate that. Joel Moody says Georgia's got great players who are also good academically and have high character. It is a really interesting thing that when you see Georgia that's recruited as well as it has, what it ultimately creates is a level of selectivity. Is that a word? Selectivity? Is that a word? It has this ability to be very, very selective in the recruits that it's going after. In other words, of elite athletes, who's the elite athlete who's also not going to give you a problem in the classroom, who's not going to give you a problem in the locker room, who's not going to give you a problem, on Saturday night after the game. Really trying to identify in the category of elite athletes, who's the 5-star among the 5 stars. And the thing that makes you a 5-star among 5 stars, or a very high, 4-star among very high 4 stars, that's some of that intangible stuff that Joel was talking about there. Back over here on YouTube for our final comments, then we're gone for today. Antoine Sampson checking in from San Diego. How about that? A G. Grace Boy says, I'm glad these guys are getting playing time at receiver for Bama. Saban's testing a few things. We're not there yet, but I like the talent. And, obviously we love going back and forth with G. Grace, but I would take him a little seriously on this. I don't think you want to throw dirt on Bama just yet. I really don't. I don't think that your evaluation of Georgia should have anything to do with Alabama either. So Bama is eventually going to probably be good. Yeah, I'd guess they probably are. But is Georgia building itself into something really good right now that's completely independent of whatever Alabama does? I think that's probably true as well. That the comparison with Alabama just isn't really that interesting for Georgia anymore. Comparing them to Bama was very appropriate when they hadn't yet beaten Alabama. But now that's just not a necessary comparison anymore. That Georgia's really comparing itself to its older version of itself. And with that in mind, Georgia seemingly is getting better and better too. Paul Moon says both things can be true. Bama being good doesn't make Georgia worse. Yeah, it's a zero-sum game when the two teams play, but it is not zero-sum game in the months leading up to that. You're absolutely right. Lee Godown's also asking about Tennessee or Kentucky. I'd say Tennessee's probably the better team, but Kentucky's probably the tougher game. I'm actually really interested to see Tennessee on Saturday. one of the questions we asked about them before the year began was, could they make it look easy in some of these early season games? And if they could, that was a big statement. Against Pitt, they did win on the road, but they didn't really make it look easy. They had to go to overtime to do it. Can they make it look a little easier against Florida on Saturday? I'm kind of interested in that. Let's see what else. Frank Patterson, Brock Bowers was Offensive Player of the Week. Very happy about that, for sure. Ace Dog, thanks for the kind words. Appreciate that. Encouraging folks to hit the thumbs up on that. Jonathan Aaron says, if and when Monken leaves for a head coaching job, who would you like to see replace him? Well, the one thing that is that Georgia's very deep on its staff right now. Now, people kind of have the referendum on Mike Bobo one way or another. And I'll let other people have that debate right now. But I think about a guy like, say, Buster Faulkner, who was an offensive coordinator before coming to Georgia, has been working as an analyst here right now. I think that Faulkner is a valuable member of this coaching staff. So I think in the event that that Monken left, I would hope that Faulkner would get some consideration for that too. No disrespect to Mike Bobo, but I really don't know I don't really know what Bobo wants as his next coaching job. But a guy like Faulkner, I think, has been here for a little while. I think he's got some credentials. I'd love to see him get some consideration. Christy asking some recruiting questions there about Mr. Hall. We'll ask Jeff about that. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that right now, Christy, but I'll ask Jeff about that for sure. All right, good comments. We'll get ready to go. Jay Shipe's calling for 2 losses for Alabama. Yeah, I'm not there yet. I'm not. I really am not. Maybe it happens. But I still think the responsibility for ending the Bama run still rests with Georgia. I don't think you can expect somebody else to do it for you. I think you're going to still have to do it yourself. And maybe that's exactly what Georgia does. Good comments. Hey, thank you all for being here. Y'all check out our friends at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, ajc.com. You can find them there for that. Braves getting homestand continuing here as they are in a battle for that drive for 5, the National League East. You can see that there. Falcons. I tell you, Arthur Smith, Falcons coach, I'm going to need him to behave a little differently in some of these press conferences. He's got a little too much bass in his voice for a guy that ain't winning nothing. Aftermath of the Falcons loss to L.A. on Saturday, I should say Sunday. You can read more of that online, ajc.com there as well. Obviously, all kinds of fun stuff to do in the kind of fall season here in the Atlanta area. You can find out more about that online there too. How about our friends at R.S. Andrews for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down? R.S. Andrews is the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the worth is promised, the price is promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that today. Also, my mom pointed this out to me. Had my father still been alive, that today would have been my mom and dad's 48th wedding anniversary. So I think about my dad all the time. I know many of you kind of find yourself in a similar situation, remembering parents that you've loved. They're no longer with you. So heavy on my mind today is thinking about all of that. And for those of you who find yourself going through something similar, including, as I mentioned before, our friend Lori from Kroger, who recently lost her mom, we think about these things a lot, and some days maybe more so than others. So thank you all for being here. We appreciate you being a part of the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We will see you back here tomorrow, 9:45 for our 1st and 15 at DawgNation.com. 10 a.m. after that, all across all platforms for DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then, everybody.